Hey everyone, it's Jenn and Melanie here. We are excited to talk to you today on Facebook Live about our podcast book. Before we get started, I want to do a little intro to our podcast book. So our book coming out on Thursday is called Podcast Authorized. So I'm going to play a little intro.
And Jenn,
Awesome. All right.
Video looks great. So you're probably asking, what is your book about? So Podcast Authorized, it's really about how to turn your podcast into a book and your book into a podcast. But the result is to 10x your business, 10x your leads, 10x your relationships, which we found like crazy. We've been doing our podcast for, over 4 years now. A Lead Expert Insider, we've been doing our podcast for, right, Jenn?
Yeah. We started 4 years ago. Our first podcast, actually, if you've known us for a really long time, we had one whole year of a podcast called Hot Chicks Write Hot Books. And that's the name of our book writing retreat that we did on the beach, which was Hot Chicks Write Hot Books on the Beach. But after a year of doing that, we switched it to Elite Expert Insider. And then we interviewed authors as well as experts on their best practices on their expertise, whether they're an entrepreneur, a CEO, or whatever they did.
So what's really cool about a podcast that we found, like my brother used to make fun of me. All right, you got like two views on YouTube with your podcast. All right. And I'm like, well, that's not necessarily our goal. Like we get more views, obviously, and listens on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. We get hundreds of thousands actually of people listening to us now. But the main goal that we do our podcast for is to build relationships and build leads. So tell you a quick story. When we first started our podcast, I called a PR company to see if we could get people to come on our podcast. So that's how new podcasting was. Now people are contacting us. Hey, can we be on your podcast? We get emails every day, multiple emails every day of people wanting to be on our podcast. So anyways, we got a lady named Mika Mossbacher, who was an author, and she came on our podcast and she had written a book, but she wasn't very happy with her publisher. And I won't diss the publisher, the name of the publisher, but you can look up her books and see her first book and see who it is. So long story short, she knew she wanted to do another book. So what she did was she referred a girlfriend to us to publish her book. So how cool was that? So from our podcast, we got a referral. And then later on, she came on and did her book and published her book with us and has since given us other referrals. So that's one strong way to do it is, you do it for these relationships. You get in front of people maybe you couldn't get in front of before because you're offering value for them. A podcast gives them an asset, a video, an audio asset, and a way to communicate with their list. Hey, I got interviewed. I mean, you show like you're an expert. Like no one wants to interview someone who's not an expert, right? Or someone who doesn't have something to say or know what they're talking about. So it really elevates your brand when you're on a podcast or have a podcast. Would you say, Jenn?
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Yeah. And then even this came about, this book came out because of our podcast. So Steve Gordon, who co-authored the book with us, never met Steve before, didn't know him from Adam. Someone booked him on our podcast. I think one of his publicists booked him on our podcast. We had the podcast with him. We talked before and after the podcast. He was impressed with us. We were impressed with him. So we decided to do a webinar together. So we did this webinar together because he produces podcasts for people. We did this webinar on how powerful it is when you use a book together with your podcast and easy ways to write a book from your podcast and vice versa. So then the webinar, the light bulbs went off with us because we're always telling people to repurpose their content. So we're like, let's just repurpose our content and make a book out of the webinar. So that's what we did. So just think about that. Your podcast, your interview, the relationship then became a book. And of course, we're pushing the book out. We're doing Facebook Lives because of this book that we wouldn't have normally done. And we're going to have a big campaign because the book is launching this Thursday. It's going to be on Amazon and everywhere books are sold for just 99 cents, by the way. The book is called Podcast Authorized. That's Podcast Authorized by Jenn Foster, Melanie Johnson, and Steve Gordon. And you can find it actually today. It is on Amazon today, but we're really doing our push on Thursday.
Yeah. Yeah. And when we had the webinar, I think there was a couple hundred people on the webinar, and we had a call to action at the end of the webinar that they could book a free 30-minute session with us and ask us anything they wanted about podcasting and book publishing. And so we had a few calls with that. A few people signed up for that, but we really wanted to give more. And so when we thought, well, let's transcribe this webinar, let's turn it into a book, just like we talked about in the webinar, so that more people can learn how to do this, that more people can see this is easy. You can do your own podcast. You can have your own book. We can help you do it. Steve can help you do the podcast, or you can do it on your own. But we want to give you these tools and these tips because you really can increase your leads, increase your business, and 10x your business with having a podcast and a book.
Yeah, one of his secret ninja tips that you'll learn a lot more about in the book is how to use your book. All right, love Jenn's cup, boss lady. She is a boss lady.
Yeah.
All right, back to my secret tip that he was giving out. So what he does is when he interviews somebody on his podcast, he offers them, he offers their entire list or client list and audience a copy of his book for free. So he sends out books to everyone. He'll send it to the person in the that interviewed him on the podcast, or he interviewed, and then he gives them a copy of the book to send out, an ebook, obviously, to send out to their entire list as a gift. So he has gotten so many leads from that strategy that he's done, which is very cool. But the only way you can do that is you have to have a book and you have to have a podcast, right?
Right. And it doesn't necessarily have to be two different subjects, right? And that's what we talk about in the book, is how you can take your podcast episodes and turn them into a book. And then you're using your book to do more podcast episodes. A lot of our authors who don't have a podcast, we've told them before, they can jump on Facebook Live and read a chapter of their book or a few pages from their book and then let people know that they have a podcast coming out. They could do that as their podcast. There's so many ways to do a podcast and so many ways to write a book.
Mm-hmm. And if you have a really good niche, you can even get sponsors. So we talked about getting leads and revenue and relationships and things like that. But you might be in a spot where you don't have revenue to start a podcast and pay someone like Steve or us to do a podcast for you and help you with your book. So a great way to do that is get sponsors ahead of time, even before you start. So if you have a specific niche or a specific market, have a girlfriend, she's a newscaster or was a newscaster here, and she started the podcast. And she went and got sponsors. She went to car dealerships. She went to other local businesses and had it sponsored and underwritten before she even started the podcast. So that's a great way to do it too. So, and it wasn't even because, so they're like, well, how many people are going to listen? But it didn't really matter because it was going to be their niche of people. They knew that she was reaching out to their target market. Even if it was 50 people that were only listening, it was those 50 people that are their target market and audience. So that's really key. And there's all kinds of stuff of how you can get get those sponsors and what you should be charging them that's out there on Google.
Yeah, awesome. I was trying to look up my phone to see, because I'm still learning. This is new, StreamYard, that we're using to do this Facebook Live.
Yeah.
To see who's watching. So I was trying to pull it up really quickly on my phone. But yeah, so I mean, those who are watching, if you have any questions, we can answer any questions about book publishing or podcasting. With the COVID-19, so many people are listening to more and more podcasts. We have an email that comes through once a week that shows like different podcasts that are happening and different people that want to be interviewed on podcasts. And one of the podcasts, it was so funny because the other weekend we were just talking about how it'd be fun just to have a podcast where you're just talking and maybe they're drunk, maybe you're just talking about whatever deep subject or whatever. And
podcast.
And I saw there's a podcast called the Drunk and Fat Podcast. I don't know, I've never listened to that, but I'm just saying there's so many podcasts out there on every subject you can imagine, even if it's just drunk talking. I don't know if you've seen the TV episodes. It's called Drunk History. They're super funny. They get celebrities and they get them drunk, and then the celebrities have to have researched the history so that they can talk about the history. And then they have other actors and actresses act out after they've talked it. So now the actress is narrating, different actors acting it out. Yeah. And so they're drunk and they're trying to explain history, and it's really funny. So if you haven't seen it, it's super funny. But what I'm trying to say is there's so many subjects that you can have on your podcast, whether you have a specific niche. Like I've listened to a few podcasts on intermittent fasting because I was looking at that for a while. Mm-hmm. There's podcasts for mothers. There's podcasts for fathers. There's podcasts that are funny. There's podcasts that are serious. There's business podcasts. I mean, you can imagine there's so many. So if you think that your business is kind of like odd or wouldn't benefit from a podcast, think again, because you can create that content once and then use it in so many ways. And that's what our book is going to be about. That's what our book is about. That's coming out on Thursday, is how you can repurpose all of that content and how to get it.
Podcast Authorized is the name of the book. Podcast Authorized is the name of the book. Yeah. So my background is TV. So, I owned, if anybody who knows about me, I was a co-owner of 2 TV stations and vice president of Johnson Broadcasting. And it was really hard to have a TV station or a radio station in the early 2000s and beyond, and earlier than that. It was like, you had to have everything from the FCC and be approval. Now everybody can have their own TV station, so to speak, radio station. So podcasting is going to have more listeners than there are radio listeners. So that's the direction you want to go in. And the barrier, there's no barrier. Just like in publishing, it used to be you had to have a traditional publisher to get your book done. In radio, to have your own radio station, you had to have the FCC approve you. To have your own radio show, you had to convince the radio station that you should have a show. And there were only so many radio stations, right? So but now, thousands, millions. So there are a lot of podcasts, but I'm here to say that it's not oversaturated yet. So there's still room for you. Don't say, oh, there's so many podcasts. I don't need to have my podcast too, because there's millions and thousands of them. But you have your own unique way of saying things. You have your own unique expertise within your industry. So whether you're a plumber, you own an air conditioning company, you own a financial services company, you're a real estate agent, you have a specific niche and expertise at what you do and have a voice. And, you can provide valuable information, either whether it's bringing people on to interview you or you do your own show by yourself and talk about your expertise.
Yeah. Hey, Beth and Russell that are watching, and anyone else who's watching, give us a shout out in a comment or let us know if you have any questions. But I've had the digital marketing agency for a long time before the book publishing came out. And I produced a few podcasts. I had a podcast called Increase Local Traffic. And I did 21 episodes on how to increase your SEO and your traffic on local marketing. So I had that podcast, and I also produced a podcast for a real estate agent. And he simply wrote his blog post about his subject, and then he read it on audio. This was back before all the cool tools we have now with StreamYard and Zoom and all the cool things we have. Yeah. But he just recorded it on his recorder on his phone, the audio recorder on your phone. He recorded himself reading his blog. And then we used that for his podcast episode. And he did one a week. And I think he did a full year of podcasts, so about 50 something podcasts. And that is still out there today. You can go and see his podcast. He get leads from it still today because the content that he put out is kind of the same. I mean, of course, real estate changes, but at the same time, first-time home buyers, pretty much the content is the same about that, right? Yes. So it's pretty awesome, all the things that one podcast did for him.
So let's say you're starting from scratch, right? You don't have a book, you don't have a podcast. Where do you start? Where do you begin? So we always suggest making the plan or making the outline for your book, and that becomes the episodes for your podcast. So, and you're like, I don't even know what the outline for my book should be. So start with the frequently asked questions you get on your expertise, your business all the time. When a client comes in, they ask the same questions over and over again. So answer those questions. Start your podcast by just doing that. People want to know. I mean, otherwise they wouldn't keep asking you those questions, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So if you guys have questions, let us know. Leave them in the comments. This video is going to be staying on Facebook, because that's what happens when you do Facebook Live. It stays. Yeah. We're also going to be putting it on YouTube. So if you're listening on YouTube, leave a comment. We'll answer your questions. And we're going to be doing this again tomorrow. So check us out tomorrow. And we'll be doing it around 11 Mountain, which is 12 Central and 10 Pacific. I think I got it right today.
Yeah, you did. Congratulations. Progress. Yay.
Yeah, and Eastern is 1 o'clock, 1 p.m.
Yes.
Eastern. Yep. I kind of did it backwards. I jumped around. I started with my time zone first. So sorry about that. But yeah, so let us know if you have questions, and go buy the book on Thursday, which will be 99 cents podcast authorized.
Yep. We'll see you tomorrow, and let us know if you have any questions.
Yeah. And we're going to leave you by playing our cute little 15-second video that will be going up on Instagram on Thursday.
Yeah. I love the video.